Hello and welcome to this extra edition of 15 Minutes on ... I'm your host, Sam Hall, and this time we are talking about the Singapore Grand Prix and the F1 driver transfer market. Joining me today is Topher Smith. Hello, Topher.
Hi there.
And so let's get cracking. Let's get straight on with this. Obviously, the big talking point from the weekend was Ferrari, both their unexpected levels of performance and those interesting pit stops and the strategy, shall we say.
Well, I think the one thing that Ferrari didn't really consider when doing their strategy was how powerful the undercut is in Singapore. No one was expecting it to be as bad, or not as bad, as good as it was. So when Vettel pitted before Leclerc, he was able to use the fresh tyres to get himself that advantage, to get himself to the point where he was ahead of Leclerc completely unexpectedly. Ferrari didn't expect it. Vettel didn't expect it. Leclerc certainly didn't expect it. He was quite annoyed about it afterwards. So that's one thing that they never factored into their strategy when they went for the pit stops, and ultimately it still turned out to be a 1-2 for Ferrari, but some might argue that it was the wrong way round.
It obviously got them the 1-2. Arguably, and I'm sure it's a view that Lewis Hamilton will share, Ferrari were definitely not on for a 1-2 if they had pitted the cars the other way round. I mean, Verstappen would have got the undercut on Vettel, so Vettel would have dropped from third or fourth, wherever he was, down to fifth or sixth potentially. So really, it's a masterstroke from Ferrari, isn't it?
That is definitely one way of looking at it. I suppose now there's no way of actually knowing with any certainty what would have happened if they had done their strategy differently. I mean, Verstappen could have potentially at least split the Ferraris. Hamilton could have been up there as well. We'll never know now. With the way that it all panned out, it could definitely be considered a masterstroke for Ferrari, even if Leclerc wasn't necessarily that happy about it, even though he still finished on the podium and got some good points towards his championship challenge. You know, you got to think about what was Ferrari's intentions that weekend, and their intentions were to get to 1-2. And if you looked at it from the point of view of maybe that undercut was deliberate to ensure that it was a 1-2, no matter of which way round it was, then yeah, I'd say it could be a masterstroke.
And what impressed you about Ferrari's unexpected performance levels? I mean, when Leclerc got pole, you could hear it over the team radio. He was not expecting that at all. That was maybe they were expecting the results in Belgium and in Italy. In fact, we know they were. But they were really not expecting anything from this weekend. They assumed that it was going to be Mercedes and Red Bull that were up there.
Well, that could be a case of they genuinely were surprised, or they were pulling a classic Mercedes in that they were somewhat sandbagging, as in saying to people, oh yeah, we might not be that good this weekend, like we expect Mercedes to beat us, maybe Red Bull as well. But in the end, it actually became a perfect weekend for them. They got the 1-2 on the podium, they got pole position. The only thing that took away that absolute perfect weekend was the fact that Kevin Magnussen in the Haas got the fastest lap in the race.
Yeah, Kevin Magnussen seems to be a slight specialist, really, at Singapore, or at least getting the fastest lap in the race, doing exactly the same as he did in 2018. Red Bull with Max Verstappen third, that's probably what we all expected. But the interesting one for me was Mercedes. Lewis Hamilton, very, very critical. It almost turned into a battle cry, his interview after the race for people who saw it. But he was highly critical that they didn't go for the undercut to get Leclerc earlier on. And then Bottas was in his closest championship rival, let's not forget. Bottas is second in the championship, the only driver really who could take the title away from Hamilton. And going into Russia, a Bottas specialist track, I mean, Bottas, deservedly, I think, should have been the lead Mercedes, given the strategy he was put on.
Well, we all know how good Mercedes is as a team. They've won multiple championships now. They've got a history rooted in the sport. But one thing that you have to remember is that the team is still run by humans. Humans who are as prone to errors as anyone else is. And there's no such thing as an absolutely perfect season for any of the teams. Like back in the days when Ferrari were dominating, they still had their off weekends from time to time. So I think what this can be put down to is the fact that Mercedes just simply did not do a good enough job that weekend. I mean, they did have the speed to at least match Ferrari, if not beat it. But operationally, from a strategic point of view, they can't get it right every single weekend. I think this was one weekend when maybe they could have played a bit of a different strategy, like you mentioned about the undercut, and whether they could have potentially played that differently to maybe at least split the Ferraris. But yeah, like I said, they're not going to get it right every single weekend, and it shows that even the powerhouse that is Mercedes is still run by humans.
And obviously, Mercedes incredibly successful. They're going for a record-breaking 6th consecutive Constructors' Championship, and it would be another Constructors' Drivers' double, which looks all but nailed on, if we're being entirely honest. Are we just being too critical of them because it's Mercedes and they've done so well recently?
I think the same with any team, not just in Formula One, but also in football, in cricket, in any sport you like. When you have one team that is dominant and they have a bad weekend, people do start to ask the question, what went so wrong for them on that occasion? But as I said previously, they are still as prone to errors as any other team in the world. And I think you just have to remember that they are humans, like I said. They are prone to mistakes, but they do come under more scrutiny when that sort of thing happens. This is supposed to be a well-oiled machine that's supposed to work weekend in, weekend out. So when there is a problem, they have to ask the question, why? Why was there such a problem? And then you've got the media, you've got the fans all asking the same questions as well. And in some cases, it does get a bit blown out of proportion. So I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with what Mercedes have been doing. Obviously, they're dominating both championships, as you said. So it just has to be put down to a bad weekend, and I don't think they should come under such serious scrutiny for it.
Looking further down the order, or looking at the drivers in general, there's a few candidates for who I'd say was driver of the day. I wouldn't say either of the Ferrari drivers, or to be honest, any of the top 6 with the Ferrari, Mercedes, and Red Bull drivers. Really, for me, the candidates start with Lando Norris, a P7 for McLaren. Really deserved, especially after that heartbreaking result at the end of the Belgium Grand Prix, where he retired at the beginning of the final lap. Pierre Gasly quietly went about his business. He's rebuilding himself, hopefully getting some confidence, finished 8th. Nico Hülkenberg, about where you'd expect, so I wouldn't say he especially caught my eye, but Antonio Giovinazzi, 10th place, and he was actually leading. Let's not forget, he became the first non-Ferrari, Red Bull, or Mercedes driver to lead a race in 4 or 5 years, which, even though it was through the pit stop phase of the race, that's an amazing stat. So I actually voted for Giovinazzi for my driver of the day. Who would you go with?
Well, on the subject of Giovinazzi, it's absolutely great that he was able to lead a Grand Prix for the first time in his career. I sort of feel as though that he is still a bit underrated. He is in a team that is a midfield team, and he doesn't always have the equipment to be able to challenge for points. But when he does, when the car is set up well and they're on form, he does put in the performances. And also take into consideration that during the race, he did receive a 10-second post-race time penalty for failing to follow the race director's instructions. He still kept 10th place and still kept that point. And one statistic that I did find out about Giovinazzi leading the race, that is the first time since, I believe it's Britain 2015, that a driver that's not from Mercedes, Ferrari, or Red Bull has led a race. That's over 4 years. I think that's an incredible statistic. I mean, back in 2015, would you have thought to yourself the next non-Mercedes, Ferrari, Red Bull driver to lead the race would be Antonio Giovinazzi?
Be entirely honest, I hadn't even thought about him being in F1 at that point. I probably hadn't even really heard about him too much. So now we've got a second topic that we're going to be discussing today, and we'll use that to fill the remaining 5-6 minutes we've got of our time. We've got the driver transfer market, and it's beginning to get quite interesting because there's not many seats left. There's only 4 seats left up for grabs after Haas confirmed, I don't want to say controversially, it was a surprising announcement, we'll say, that Kevin Magnussen and Romain Grosjean would both be remaining with the team. Now, those drivers have had an interesting relationship this year. Grosjean and Magnussen have both had moments where they're on form and long periods where they're not on form. But Grosjean, for me, is the surprise. He's almost had a 2-season run of being out of form, out of sorts. What was your first impression when you saw the news that they were keeping the same drivers?
Initially, I was surprised. I was fairly certain that Haas would go for Hulkenberg, as was rumoured in a lot of media outlets. But having taken some time to read into news and actually read the reasonings behind it, it actually does kind of make sense in a way. So if you think about what Günther Steiner said, his quote here was, "Experience and the need for it has been one of the cornerstones of Haas F1 team. And with Romain Grosjean and Kevin Magnussen racing for the team in 2020, we continue to have a driver lineup that offers us a solid platform to continue our growth." I think that's actually a really good reasoning for keeping the same driver lineup of Romain Grosjean and Kevin Magnussen. Haas is a team that is still relatively new to Formula One. They haven't reached the podium yet, but they're becoming a consistent point-scoring team. And the one thing that they need if they're going to continue to grow, especially with the 2021 regulation changes coming up, is they need that consistency. And if they were to change drivers, i.e. take on Hulkenberg instead of Grosjean, that can not quite rock the boat, but it then lacks that consistency. You keep Magnussen on, but then you bring on a new driver who's then got to integrate into the team, has to grow with the team. And that comes with its own problems. Like, not necessarily obvious problems, but there is that issue of integration that does take longer for some drivers than others. And as for Grosjean, he does deserve his place in Formula One. If you look at his junior record, he was very fast when he was coming up through the ranks, and he even won the GP2 title. And he deserves his spot, but he needs a bit more consistency, in my opinion. When he's on form, when he's bringing his A game, he is a very, very fast driver. But he needs to be able to deliver that on more weekends than he actually is. So if he can sort that out in 2020, become a more complete and consistent driver, I think that Günther Steiner will be more than happy with his decision to re-sign him.
Yeah, the problem for me is that Grosjean's been out of sorts for so long now that when a driver begins a downward spiral in Formula One, it doesn't often improve too rapidly. So it is a surprise for me that he's still there, but he's still there. As far as we know, the seats that are available, there's one seat alongside Kimi Räikkönen at Alfa Romeo. I suspect Giovinazzi will stay on, especially after a couple of good, strong performances, including that points finish in Singapore, widely acknowledged as the most physical and hardest track on the calendar at the present time. There's a seat up for grabs, 2 seats up for grabs, really, that we know who's going to be in them. It's a Red Bull and a Toro Rosso seat. So really, Albon and Gasly, one will be in one team, one will be in the other. So the other seat is Williams. And for me, this is where Nico Hulkenberg is going to end up, because it's where he started his F1 career. It's where he got his pole position in 2010 at the Brazilian Grand Prix in those tricky drying conditions. Do you think Hulkenberg will end up at Williams, or can you see him sitting a year out, or maybe going elsewhere permanently?
So I am going to have to disagree with you on this one, Sam. I believe that Williams seats will end up going to Formula 2 racer Nicholas Latifi. And Latifi has shown himself to be a very good performer in the junior categories. He's won races in just about any championship he's ever competed in. He's not quite on the same level as the likes of Van Dorn and De Vries, for example. But while Latifi is a very fast driver in himself, he also brings backing, which is what a team like Williams at this moment in time desperately needs. They had the backing of Orlen from Robert Kubica. They're losing that at the end of this season. So by then bringing Nicholas Latifi on board, he brings his own Canadian backers with him to help fund the team. And Hulkenberg does not have the same sorts of funds that Latifi does. And I'd never like to see a pay driver get a seat over a talented driver. I think in terms of talent, I would put Hulkenberg over Latifi. But this is a sport that requires money. And if you've got a lot of money behind you, you are going to progress. Like, I don't like it to be that way. I would prefer to see talent. but it is the way it is. And I think for the reasons that Williams is struggling and they need to get their money on board to help them develop the car, that seat is going towards Latifi, in my opinion.
Yep, like you say, we'll have to agree to disagree with that one. In my eyes, Latifi, he's a good driver, but there's being a good F2 driver and there's being a good F1 driver. Latifi's been beaten and usurped by drivers like George Russell, Lando Norris, Charles Leclerc. You've got Max Verstappen. I just don't think he's a driver that's going to strike fear into those drivers who have beaten him already. And especially if Williams is anything like it is this year, I can't see him striking any fear into drivers. But that we're going to have to call it a day there. This is a wrap. Topher, where can people find you on your social media channels?
So you can find me on Twitter at Topher Racing. That's Topher Racing. So if you could look me up, give me a follow, it'd be much appreciated. I shall bring you all the news that I can. I tend to focus more on Formula E, but I also retweet stuff from Formula One, from the World Endurance Championship, from World Rallycross. Just anything to do with racing, you can find it on my Twitter.
Yep, and I've been Sam Hall. You can find me across social media on Instagram, Twitter, at Sam Hall Sport. This has been 15 minutes on Formula One and the driver transfer market. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.
This has been 15 minutes on Formula One and the drivers market. Produced by Florian Schmeis. This has been a high-speed Autobahn production for Downforce Radio, the nation's motorsport station.